Good morning. My name is Robert Shaw, and I welcome you to this video presentation regarding simulation problem development as presented by the National Board for Respiratory Care. As you can see, I'm the psychometrician for the program, and this is a video based on a session that was offered in the year 2015 during the summer forum that is sponsored by the American Association for Respiratory Care. And the MBRC board thought it would be good to give people an opportunity to see this content who were unable to participate in the AARC summer forum. The objectives that I have for the presentation are listed here on this slide. We're going to talk about specifications regarding a number of elements that are found in the simulation examination. The simulation examination more generally is referred to as patient management problems, which are intended to simulate what happens when a respiratory therapist encounters a patient or patients throughout his or her typical day. And so we'll talk about the specifications regarding the whole problems. We'll learn later there are 20 of those on the exam. Sections within a given problem. We'll learn there are multiple sections. And then also options. So there are sometimes several options associated with any given section inside of a problem. And then have some guidance, transition to a sort of second section, some guidance about the development of problem content, as I'll explain more later. Within this slide, we have effectively the specifications for each form of the MBRC's simulation examination. And so you can see that the intent here is to represent the kinds of patients that a therapist would see, again, on a day-to-day basis. And there are, at the bottom, 20 of these problems in total. There are that will contribute to an individual score. The MBRC offers instant scoring, so a test taker will also encounter two pre-test problems that are mixed in, and to the test taker, a pre-test problem will look no different than any other problem on the examination. As far as specification in regard to the quantity of sections within problems that someone would encounter, this slide is intended to summarize those. So across the entire exam, a test taker will encounter anywhere between 90 and 110 sections. And as you'll see, the phrase along what is called the critical path. And I'll explain more about what the critical path is, but essentially if an individual makes no mistakes while moving through sections of problems, then he or she will have followed what is called the critical path within a problem. There can be additional branching sections that can add to the length for a given test taker. In particular, if an individual makes an incorrect choice, then one of the reasons that patient management problems exist is you get the opportunity to assess how someone can recover from making a mistake. So that can add literally to the content for some individuals. Testing time stays the same. So an individual will have 4 hours to submit responses to the problem, regardless of whether he or she enters a branch or not. Then getting down to the bottom of this slide, within a given problem, more often than not, there will be 5 sections. Although there is a little bit of variability allowed there, there could be as few as 4, as many as 6 within a given problem. But on average, there will be 5 sections. As far as section types within a problem, this breaks down 2 ways. There are occasions when the purpose of the section is to assess whether the test taker knows the kind of information that will be helpful, that will facilitate care, and then also sections in which an individual will be asked to make decisions. While making decisions, you'll see that there are 2 types of sections inside of the decision-making sections. One in which the individual is asked to make the single best selection, and then others in which the individual is asked to make multiple selections. Those sorts of problems are designed particularly when there are occasions when a respiratory therapist is expected to be able to move on multiple fronts. So there may be several pieces of equipment that need to be gathered up, anticipating a procedure that's going to be done. Or there may be an emergency situation, so there needs to be multiple things happening at once. And so that's the intent behind sections in which someone would make multiple choices or multiple decisions. Then we have the information gathering sections, and these tend to be fairly heavy in content because there can be anywhere between 12 and 18 options per section. And about half of the options in a given section are going to contribute to care and will be associated with positive points. And we'll talk later about the ranges of points, or the range of points that can be associated with options. About half of the options will make no contribution to care, or even expose a patient to unnecessary risk or even expense. And you can use the most sophisticated information gathering technique, but if practically useful information was available by using something pretty simple, then this kind of situation gives you the opportunity to assess someone's knowledge and mastery of those distinctions. At any rate, the half that either make no contribution to care or expose patient to unnecessary risk or expense will be given negative points. There's also the possibility that an option, and this is not limited to information gathering sections, or options rather, but there can be point values of 0 associated with options, although at the development stage, that is, while problem content is being developed, we will stay away from knowingly giving an option a point value of 0. While ultimately options can wind up with a point value of 0, we let the examination committee make that decision in the context of information from actual candidates. Otherwise, both the MBRC and the test taker deserve to observe some level of differentiation among candidates from every option. If an individual is going to spend time considering an option, selecting an option, then that act ought to increase someone's score or decrease someone's score. Having someone's score not move at all is not the way we want to design problems on purpose. But there are, again, occasions after seeing the way individuals respond to options where the exam committee may make the decision to effectively, as they call it, zero out the option. In DM sections, decision-making sections, there'll be those that have, again, a single best answer, and the length of such a section, one can expect somewhere in the vicinity of 5 options. There could be as few as 4, in which case, that section pretty much just looks like a sort of standard multiple choice item. except there's been a whole lot of information potentially that has led up to that selection from other sections that came before it. And then there could be as many as 6 options in such a section, that is, in which one is making a single choice. Within the multiple decision-making sections, there will be more choices, and sort of mirroring what happens with information gathering sections, about half of the options will be associated with positive points, and about half associated with negative points. And again, we're also showing you a range here. There could be as few as 8, as many as 12 options inside of such a section. If we look at point totals across the whole examination and using the sort of midpoints of the available ranges, a typical examination will have somewhere in the vicinity of the low 400s as far as the point total. These point totals are not controlled across test forms, is an important thing to understand. And so the cut score should be expected to move around depending on which form an individual takes. So if you're someone who has a group of test takers taking the simulation examination, they're going to be responding to multiple different test forms, and so you should have the expectation to observe that different cut scores will affect the results of those individuals inside that group. But again, what you see here is that about 60% of the points on an examination will come from information gathering sections, about 40% of the points will come from decision-making sections, and then you can see the allowable range, the minimum max number of points within an examination of both the information gathering type and decision-making type. I mentioned cut score before, and so let me give a little more detail here. And another point to make here is that the cut score for the simulation examination is done differently starting in January 2015 as compared to the way the cut score was done before. In the past, there was a separate cut for information gathering sections and decision-making sections, so 2 cut scores effectively, and you had to get past both of the cut scores in order to pass the examination overall. Now all the points, regardless of the source, meaning whether it comes from an information gathering section or a decision-making section, they're all put into the same bucket, and so there's just one cut score, and the way that score is calculated requires 2 steps, as you'll see summarized on this slide. Some of the options will be given a label by the examination committee with the letter R to indicate that it's expected to be required of someone who is minimally competent. So it's always in that context of minimal competence that option labeling occurs. There's also options that are labeled as forgivable, and these will have negative scores. In contrast to the options that are given the R label, which have positive scores, forgivable options will have negative scores, and more specifically, a mild negative, a -1, as opposed to a -2 or a -3. So forgivable options are limited to only the mild errors, and the label forgivable is intended to be descriptive. If someone makes a mistake for an understandable reason, and again, in the context of someone who's minimally competent makes a mistake for an understandable reason, then the exam committee can choose to associate the forgivable label with the option. And so remember that a forgivable option has a point value -1, and so adding the -1 to the total of scores from other required options effectively moves the cut score down a point, and in turn would make it easier to pass, moves the passing standard down for that problem. And that's the first step in determining the cut score, is first figure out what the cut score is for each of the 20 problems, and then simply sum the cut scores across the 20 problems into a grand total, and there is the total cut score that's compared to test taker scores, and is the basis for passing and failing the examination. In the second major bullet point here on this slide, you'll see that the cut score can be expected to wind up in the vicinity of 73% of the maximum points. If we're thinking about an exam that has, in round numbers, 400 points, and the cut is at 73, then just doing a quick mental math, that should tell you that the cut score is in the vicinity of somewhere in the vicinity of about a little more than 350 points. The way there's a set of guidelines for information gathering sections and decision-making sections in regard to the cut score, and you can see that the range is higher and tighter for information gathering sections than it is for decision-making sections. But then understanding that about 60% of the points come from information gathering sections, 40% come from decision-making sections. The place where we typically expect the cut score to wind up is again somewhere in that 73 zone after pulling all the information together. That's not to say that 73% is applied across every test form. Again, the way the cut score is determined is summarized in that first slide. We have to look and see what the exam committee has labeled as required, labeled as forgivable, and work through those two steps because different problems can get assembled into test forms in different configurations or different mixes, so that can cause the cut score to change for that reason. So a summary of what we've covered so far is here. The intent here is to give you a sort of idea about the skeleton behind the simulation examination, the specifications for the way problems are put together, the way that points are created, the way cut scores are determined, so forth. I'm going to move forward to some guidance about problem development. The examination committee had brailled out some outlines for some problems back in anticipation of the workshop in summer of 2015, and so these slides are intended to help that group work through the task of putting flesh on the bones, as it were, adding content to problems that were about halfway developed. The one thing that I wanted the group to understand back then was that the content of the problems had been settled. We weren't asking a problem or content contributor to send a problem off in a different direction about a different kind of patient, but instead follow the guidance that the examination committee had given, and also pay attention to what the examination committee had indicated were some positive options that would deserve positive scores, so they could, again, sort of see how that problem was supposed to track. But then, and also don't concern yourself as a content contributor about the problem or the section specifications, because that information had already been baked into the documents that the content developers were working with. In our next bullet point, we see the range of scores that any given option can be given. And so they go from -3, which would be associated with probably a fatal or near fatal sort of decision, a really bad choice, all the way up to +3, which would be a life-saving choice. The +2 and the -2 would be either strongly contributing to care or strongly detracting from care. The +1 and the -1, again, are either making a contribution to care or making a fairly low-level detraction from care. And then again, we talked about the 0 to some extent before. Most options do not have zeros. and certainly not by design. Only after we get feedback from test takers could an examination committee typically make the decision to zero out an option. And we also told our content developers don't concern themselves as they were developing the content about which of the options should be given the required label, which should be given the forgivable label, that we would let the examination committee make those decisions downstream after the content had been developed. In terms of thinking about how or what content should be added to these problem skeletons, we want to encourage the developers of content to think about and tell us who the patient was. You know, how old was he or she? What's their gender? Or any other relevant facts about who the patient was. What health issues did that individual present with? And also understand that these problems don't always start in the emergency department, because that's not the way a respiratory therapist's typical day works. Many of the patients that they'll see have already been admitted, been there for a while, and so the opening of a simulation problem could be several days into a patient's course. Who are the other healthcare personnel that might be interacting with the therapist or interacting with the patient, who may be participating in the decisions that are being made about the care plan, and so on. And then also, where is the care delivered? Again, is it the emergency department? Is it the ICU? Is it the post-anesthesia care unit, and so forth, are the sorts of information that we ask content developers to provide. And then thinking about moving away from the opening scenario into other sections of problems. Sometimes time is an important issue, so it's critical for the content developer to give serious thought to, okay, here I am moving to the next section. Is this the next minute, the next hour, the next day, several days downstream? Where are we in this patient's course? I owe it to a test taker to be clear about where we are, at what point in time we are at, and now that we're presenting a new section to them. And then also in the stem of that new section, what new information is relevant to making whatever decision is going to be made, or what information is going to be gathered. It's also important to remember as a content developer that one can make use of the option responses to add new information. And that can be a useful and subtle tool for informing a test taker about something new some new piece of information that has just become available. Thinking for a moment about all of the negative options, and our content developers had to do a lot of this because the examination committee, in many cases, had not developed much in the way of negative options, or options that deserve negative scores, so effectively incorrect answers, which is the toughest part of any exam content development. But in thinking about it, the one word of caution that I gave was be careful in the option response. So after someone makes a selection, what are they going to see next? It's best not to tip off the test taker when he or she has made a poor choice, or made a choice that just costs him or her some points, because that's going to elevate the test taker's anxiety. And it's well known that as anxiety goes up or spikes, performance goes down, and that then can become a source of measurement error associated with the test scores, which we want to avoid. So words like you'll see in the list here, where you simply tell the test taker, okay, now you've made the selection, we're taking note of that fact, or it was done potentially, or that thing that you wanted to order was scheduled, or that appointment, that visit, and so forth, or that an order has been written, But what we don't want are words that really clearly indicate that that was an incorrect choice you just made. And in the context of making incorrect choices in decision-making sections, the phrase that we very often use is, as you'll see it in the last bullet point, not done, make another selection. The older phrase that maybe some are familiar with was physician disagrees, make another selection. But it's not always the physician who disagrees that makes something wrong. And so some years ago, the MBRC exam committee for ClinSim has moved away from that as an option response and much more frequently uses what you see here. We'll talk about branches for a moment here as opportunities to deepen the assessment, and that's because they can serve a couple of purposes. One is you get the opportunity to assess whether somebody can recover from making a mistake, in which case the branch comes from an option that will have a negative score. It's also possible to have a branch so that an individual can, because there could be two equally viable choices, or if not equally viable, at least one viable or one really good one that's even better. And so it gives one an opportunity to explore those sorts of clinical scenarios. We gave our content developers the opportunity to suggest branches if they felt that they would be helpful. On the other hand, we don't insert branches just for the sake of adding branches. It really needs to serve the overall clinical purpose. And sometimes, in some problems, there really is no good place to put a branch, so there aren't any. To illustrate a little more about what we're talking about with branches, this is a fairly classic scenario showing you 5 sections along the critical path. The problem starts with the therapist deciding what information ought to be gathered, having gathered the information, makes one decision, and then from there flows into a third section in which yet another decision is going to be made. And in this case, at least one of the options has a score of -1, and that will, and selecting that option is going to send the test taker over into the branch that we see down here at the bottom. Everybody else who makes the proper choice up in the third section is going to get +1 and move on to the next decision-making section, the fourth one in the critical path. In the meantime, you have the group of people who have to deal with this extra section and understand as well that within that section they need to get back to that same fourth section as everybody else is getting. And so this is really an opportunity to recover from making that mistake that had occurred up in the third branch, or third section. And then at the end, everybody's come back together in the fourth section, and then everybody proceeds on through to the final section. This is another configuration. They don't all have to be configured like the one above. In particular, I want to point out that you can start, or a concept developer can start with a decision-making section. There can be enough information given in the opening scenario, and the pathway forward to a decision is clear enough that decision-making can begin immediately. Typically, there will be an information-gathering section somewhere in a problem, although that's not a mandate. The mandate is, as we described before, regarding the specifications about the number of sections across the entire exam. But it is possible for a given problem not to have an information gathering section. So that, too, is an important piece of information for me to convey, given this opportunity, particularly if you're your job is to help prepare individuals to take the examination. they need to understand that if they work through a problem, they experience no information gathering section. That doesn't mean the problem's broken, the system's broken. It just means that's the way that problem was designed. At any rate, another thing that this illustrates is this time the branch is occurring in the for section, and this is intended to illustrate the example where there's one really good response, which is associated with 2 points. One simply good response, though not as good as the +2 option. So this is an opportunity to explore that other viable clinical pathway. But still, we need to get right back to the critical path within the next section. And so one other thing that we can see here is the point value of 0 associated with moving from the branch back to the critical path. The policy here with branches, and that's true of both the one we saw before and the one we saw just a second ago, is whoever goes through the critical path needs to wind up with 1 point more than the folks who go through the branch, regardless of the kind of branch. So that's why you see, though, in this case, you get 1 point for moving from section 3 to section 4. You wind up with 0 points, or the sum of the -1 and the +1, when you pass through the branch and ultimately wind up back in section 4. In this second case, you get 2 points for moving from section 4 to section 5. You get 1 point for going through the branch. So again, you're 1 point below the critical path group. So a quick summary of what we've covered. We've described developing content that needs to be associated with information in the opening scenario. Just think of your who, what's, who's the patient, who's the healthcare personnel, what are the problems that are being presented. We've talked about developing stems of sections, in particular thinking about how much time has passed since the last section and making sure that test takers are aware of that fact. Talked about guidance about developing option text, response text, how we don't want to tip off test takers when they're making wrong responses. And then the last task for the group at the summer forum was to develop the problem content as far as they could. And the MDRC will continue to do that. Probably thought this model worked fairly successfully, wound up with 12 new problems out of this process by effectively sort of developing content about halfway and then letting folks out in the field finish those up. Those problems are now transitioning over to the exam committee, and they're being given the opportunity to consider them, edit them, and then pre-test them so that we can see how they perform. And then once that's determined, we'll be able to put them onto the scored portions of examination forms that are still further in the future. So thank you for listening to the workshop presentation here, and I'll be signing off now.